William, thank you for joining me.
Happy to be here, Nicole.
President Biden signed into law the Inflation Reduction Act, which has major climate change provisions in it. Did that come as a surprise or was that expected of his presidency?
No, it absolutely came as a surprise. I mean, to hear environmental and green energy groups talk about this bill, it's just incredible that it happened at all. And as you mentioned, it is a surprise that it happened under President Biden because if you remember as a candidate, nobody really thought that Joe Biden was the environmental climate change green candidate. The Sunrise Movement, the very powerful youth climate movement, gave his initial campaign issues on climate an F minus, gave the lowest possible grade. And there were a lot of groups that have been pushing for this to happen over many, many decades. And it just so happened that he got a Congress that worked and a legislative session that brought this all together. But nobody really thought that this was going to be Joe Biden's crowning moment in the environmental movement, but it absolutely is.
What does the Inflation Reduction Act actually do to address climate change? And why isn't that in the name if it has so many provisions related to climate change?
No, that's a very good question. And this is what happens with some legislation where it's all about the branding. And so, I mean, if I want to pass a bill, I'm going to call it the, Free Candy and Puppies for Everyone Act because everyone can sign on to that. If you remember when this was passed, inflation was a terrible, terrible problem that was inflicting pain on millions of American families. So there was reason to call it the Inflation Reduction Act. And in fairness, there were some aspects of it that did reduce inflation. There were prescription drug reduction costs. There was some deficit reduction that would bring down inflation as well. But by and large, as you mentioned, this is a climate change bill. It is an enormous effort, really a truly historic effort to move the American economy away from fossil fuels and towards green, cleaner energy. I mean, as some environmental advocates put it, this legislation is historic and keeps America in the climate fight. I mean, this is, in some ways, helps really negate the argument that has been made for many, many years that it is economically advantageous to use fossil fuels as opposed to clean energy. This starts to upend that apple cart. And the estimates are that this act, if all the provisions are put into place, will cut America's greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030. The Postal Service, which buys millions of post trucks to drive all around all of our neighborhoods all over this country, there's money in here to switch to electric vehicles. For businesses, it's the same thing. To make their offices more efficient, to make their electricity delivering, the power lines that carry electricity, to make those cleaner. For consumers, there's all sorts of rebates to make the cost of electric vehicles and solar panels and heat pumps. Again, all things that are better for the climate, they really reduce emissions. There's massive subsidies in there for those as well. There's also, and this is another thing that environmental activists are truly amazed that it survived in this legislation, is a great deal of focus on environmental justice. And what we mean by that is that anyone that has studied the history of how industrialization has happened in America knows that a lot of the dirtiest power plants, chemical factories, shipping ports are put in poor and minority neighborhoods in America. And those things cause a lot of traffic and a lot of noise and a lot of pollution. And they also really affect air quality and the quality of life. And that has fallen disproportionately on those communities. This bill contains a lot of efforts to try to remedy some of those things. So, again, it's hard to encapsulate how massive a move this is, but by every measure, this is the single biggest effort that the U.S. government has ever made to try to make a dent in the emissions that cause climate change.
So, the Inflation Reduction Act could have considerable impact. But if we take a step back and look at some of our recent history, President Obama saw many of his climate change provisions undone by former President Trump, who argued that the threat of climate change was overblown. Could the Inflation Reduction Act face that same fate if the next president is hostile to those provisions?
You make a very good point, Nicole. That is a huge issue, and part of the reason that former President Trump was able to undo former President Obama's climate initiatives was because those were executive actions. Again, not to bore people with too much, but if you remember, there was a major climate piece of legislation that was proposed, made it into the Senate, but eventually was defeated under President Obama. So Obama's main ability, the levers that he had available to him, were executive actions. Those, by dint of how they are done, can be undone by a subsequent president, and Donald Trump did many of those things when he was in office. This, the Inflation Reduction Act, is a much more durable piece of legislation, and so it's much harder to undo. Also, and this is another interesting provision about this law, is that these subsidies will be spread all over the nation. So they will be subsidies to build manufacturing facilities and to upgrade utilities in states and cities all over the country, including a lot of red states. And so there is going to be a built-in constituency over the years as these subsidies continue, that a battery plant in Georgia or a new manufacturing facility in Michigan or in Iowa, those will now have Republican senators and congressmen who love those jobs and love those factories in their districts, and they'll want to protect them, and they won't want to see them undone. Also, and this is another major part of all of this legislation, is that these subsidies are built to last for 10 years, which again sounds like not that much time, but part of the problem that we have had over the past is that subsidies that come and go from the government, they vary all the time. And so nobody can really plan a long-term financial strategy if you never know that the subsidy that you're banking on is going to disappear. This builds a very steady stream of money for a decade, which is a good for a business cycle. So those will be much more durable.
Do you think President Biden will address climate change in the State of the Union or celebrate the passage of this law?
I would be shocked if he didn't. This is such a historic achievement if you look at it from the perspective of the environmental community. So I think he's got a lot to brag about in this on the environment and clean energy front. I'd be surprised if he didn't. I think there's a much stronger incentive for people. They want the government to act on this. They see droughts and fires and things affecting their communities, and they know that this is a real issue. And I think polls have done a bad job of capturing that. So my sense is that he will talk about this. If I was his advisors, I'd think you have an enormous legislative victory here that has energized a certain slice of your base enormously. So I'd be very surprised if he didn't bring it up.
Climate change continues to wreak havoc on so many parts of this country and costs billions of dollars every year. What are experts saying about how America is combating climate change now?
That is an enormous problem facing this country. And dealing with the impacts of climate change, it's really a two-pronged approach. It's, number one, dealing with the damages and the impacts that we're seeing today and that we know will continue into the future. And number two, trying to stop adding to the future damage by lowering our carbon emissions. That's what the Inflation Reduction Act tries to do, which is going forward, try to do less of the things that we know cause the worst impacts of climate change. But even if everything in this country switched to 100% renewable electricity today, we still have put so much carbon up into the atmosphere that those impacts are going to continue for decades to come, and there's really nothing we can do about a lot of that. So we just have to be preparing for that. And that's a lot of different things. That's making homes and cities and communities and states more resilient to these things so that houses can withstand a fire that sweeps through, that people use water more efficiently. We're seeing this huge fight now out in the West where a historic drought has dried up large amount of the Colorado River, which feeds 7 western states. Those states have not been able to agree on how to divvy up the remaining water. That's another thing we have to deal with. There's also the issue of all of the coastal communities around the country, that when you couple sea level rise with the likely intensifying storms that are going to come washing across their shores, how do we protect those communities? I mean, I was just down in Florida after Hurricane Ian, and whole communities along the Florida coast had been just scraped clean by that storm. How do you rebuild those communities so that it's done equitably, that people are not forced out of their homes, but that they can withstand the next storm. So those are all the issues that are facing the country. Those are long-term, multi-generational issues that it's a very fraught policy issue in this country, but there is no easy answer, frankly.
I want to shift gears to the administration's passage of an infrastructure law. What does that do to address the chronic problem of low funding and crumbling infrastructure?
That is a step in this direction, which is to plow billions of dollars to states and cities all around the country to try to address these critical issues: the roads that we drive on, the bridges that we move gear on, shipping ports, train stations. I mean, there are airports, there are an enormous amount of work to be done. And this is part of that. And one of the arguments that the president was just making, he was in Maryland and New Jersey recently talking about two particular rail improvements. Again, these are rail improvements that have been needed for years. People have been identifying these as major, major problems. They're finally got some money now to try to deal with this. But the issue has always been that nobody wants to spend those upfront dollars because the benefits often accrue to the next politician who's in office, the next mayor, the next governor, the next congressperson. And so biting the bullet and paying this big upfront cost so that people can commute to work easier and people can ship their goods easier. That's been a very, very tough fight. We're starting to do some of that now. So again, these things are often linked together, but it is again a slow process, but we're starting to see some movement on that front as well.
One of the poignant parts of what you're pointing out is that infrastructure and climate change solutions are often local. So, how does a president address a local issue from a national platform?
It is a real challenge, but as we've been describing, every time you fix a road, every time you build a new battery manufacturing facility, every time you improve a power grid, that affects people at the local level. Now, President Biden may not be getting credit for a new battery plant that's starting to open up in Georgia, or the fact that people didn't lose their power in this cold snap that's hitting Texas, or any of those things. So on some level, federal legislation trickles down to localities. And so you could argue that that is the role of the federal government, which is to put federal funds towards these types of projects. They do end up benefiting local communities. The connection between those things is often lost. And in fact, you often will see politicians championing local infrastructure or climate-related projects in their communities when they very well may have voted against those things when they were a part of a massive piece of legislation in Washington. That is unfortunately the nature of cynical politics in this country. But all of these efforts do end up happening in local communities. And so with the infrastructure bill, with the Inflation Reduction Act, all of those things will benefit individual people all over this country. Again, sometimes people will lose the connection between, oh, that was a bill that was passed 3 years ago, and now the port right next door to where my kids go to school has been cleaned up and there's less diesel smoke in their classroom. But that's the connection. That happens, but people may not make that connection in their minds very overtly.
William Brangham, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure, Nicole. Great to see you.